The year was 1867, and the desert was a cruel judge of men. Heat poured down in waves, the kind that scorched through hat and skin until bones felt brittle. Wind swept the canyon floor, dragging dust like a living thing, clawing at the eyes and throat of anyone foolish enough to wander alone. One man did. He walked his horse slow, boots grinding grit, every step heavy with weariness. His name was Daniel Kane, though most had long forgotten it, just as he tried to forget the war that had left him hollow inside. Kane rode as if the road were punishment, his hat brim-shadowed eyes that carried years of watching men bleed out in mud and dust, too many to count. A Sharp's rifle rested in its scabbard, though his hand rarely touched it anymore. He had killed enough. The war had taught him two things, that death was easy and mercy was harder. He lived now, with little more than the horse beneath him and the saddlebag slung across its flank, a canteen, a crust of bread, a Bible with pages he never opened. The trail wound between cliffs where the wind whistled like ghosts. He kept his head low, wary. This was Apache land, and even the bravest drovers avoided it when they could. Kane had no choice. He was headed for the next town where he might barter labor for coin, but more than that he rode, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking was a kind of death he feared most. The storm came sudden. A wall of dust rose in the distance, rushing closer, swallowing horizon and sun. Kane cursed under his breath, tugging his kerchief higher across his face. The horse snorted nervous. He found a break in the cliffs, a narrow wash where boulders leaned against one another, forming a shallow cave. He guided the horse inside, tied the reins to a jut of rock, and hunkered low as the storm screamed through the canyon. Dust stung like needles, filling nose and mouth. He spat grit, muttered prayers he didn't mean, and waited. When the storm eased, silence pressed heavy. Only the slow drip of sand falling from rock broke the stillness. Kane stepped out, brushing his coat sleeve clean, and froze. He was not alone. On the far side of the wash, half hidden among boulders, lay a figure. Small, frail against the stone, an Apache woman. Blood seeped from her side, dark against the torn buckskin dress. Her hair, black as ravens, was tangled with dust. In her arms, clinging like a shadow, was a child no older than 5. The boy's eyes were wide, black pools of fear fixed on Kane. Kane's hand went instinctively to his rifle, then stopped. He could have walked away. Should have. White men and Apache did not meet without blood following close behind. If he helped her, her people would call it meddling, perhaps betrayal. If he left her, the desert would finish what the bullet started. His heart pounded, war drums steady in his chest. The woman's gaze lifted, sharp despite the pain. She did not beg. She did not fear. She simply held the child tighter and watched him with the eyes of someone who knew what men were capable of. Kane crouched, words rough in his throat. "You're hurt." The woman flinched at the sound, her fingers twitching toward a small knife at her belt. The child whimpered. Kane lifted both hands, palms out, slow as a man easing up on a rattler. "Easy. I ain't here to finish it." He glanced at her wound. A rifle shot low across the ribs. Fresh. Whoever fired it wasn't far. Hoofbeats echoed faint in the distance. Kane stiffened. Riders. He crept higher against the rock wall, peered out toward the trail. Through the settling dust he spotted them, blue coats. Soldiers. 3 of them. Sweeping the wash, rifles slung across shoulders, eyes hard with the hunt. They were hunting her. Kane pressed back into the shadows, jaw tight. He looked once more at the woman. Her breath was shallow, lips pale. The boy trembled in her arms. If the soldiers found her here, they'd kill her, maybe take the child. He knew the cruelty men in uniform could deliver. He delivered it himself, once. The choice cut into him like a blade. He could stay hidden, let the soldiers do what soldiers did, and walk away clean. Or he could interfere. He thought of the nights he'd woken in sweat, faces of the dead crowding his sleep. He thought of the guilt that rode him heavier than any saddle. Mercy was harder. Kane moved. He grabbed the reins of his horse, yanked them free, and guided the animal toward her. The woman's eyes widened in disbelief as he lowered the reins into her hand. "Take him," Cain whispered. "Ride hard. Don't stop till you're safe." The woman hesitated. Her lips parted, but no words came. The boy tugged at her sleeve, eyes darting to the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Cain pressed the reins firmly into her grip. She mounted clumsily, pain twisting her features, clutching the child to her. For a heartbeat, she stared down at Cain. Something unspoken passed between them. A question, a promise. Then she spurred the horse, and the animal bolted into the canyon, carrying mother and child away into the shroud of dust. Cain stood alone, heart hammering. He had given away his only horse. In Apache country, on foot, that was near enough a death sentence. The soldiers thundered into the wash a moment later. Their eyes swept the rocks, searching. One spotted Cain and barked, "You there? Seen any Injuns come through?" Cain squared his shoulders, dust coating his face, sweat dripping into his beard. "Storm near blinded me," he answered, voice steady. "Ain't seen a soul." The soldiers eyed him, suspicion sharp. One rode closer, staring at Cain's boots, the ground around him. "Funny," the man muttered. "Tracks here look fresh." His hand slid toward his rifle. Cain's own rifle was still strapped across his back, but he didn't reach for it. He forced calm, though his blood burned with tension. "Storm scatters tracks quick," he said. "Could be mine." For a long, blistered moment, silence hung. Then the officer spat in the dust, motioned to his men. "Come on, we'll find her." The riders wheeled their mounts and galloped off down the canyon, chasing shadows. Cain exhaled slow, knees weak. He had lied for her. Risked his neck. He leaned against the rock, chest heaving, and for the first time in years, he felt something like relief. The relief didn't last. Hours later, Cain trudged alone, sun sinking low, his boots sinking deep into sand. No horse, no shelter, canteen near empty. His legs ached, lungs burned. Coyotes howled in the distance. He thought of the woman riding away on his horse, the boy clinging to her. Maybe they'd make it. Maybe not. But at least they had a chance. He wondered if she'd tell her people what he had done, or if they'd hunt him anyway. Night fell hard. Stars pierced the black sky, cold and sharp. Cain stumbled, nearly fell, caught himself against a jagged rock. His body trembled with exhaustion. He lowered himself onto the ground, head against a stone. Every muscle screamed for rest. The desert was never quiet at night. Wind moaned through canyons, insects chirped, owls hunted in the dark. Cain listened, half dreaming, half waking. Then he heard it, the soft scrape of feet on stone. His eyes snapped open. Shapes moved in the shadows above, silhouettes against the starlight. Warriors, dozens of them. Their bows and lances gleamed in faint moonlight. Silent, watchful, like spirits carved from the rock itself. Cain's throat went dry. He pushed himself upright, hand inching toward his rifle. But even he knew it would do no good. From the cliff's edge, one figure stepped forward, tall and broad-shouldered, feathers woven into dark hair. A leader. His gaze burned into Cain's like fire catching tinder. Around him, more shapes fanned out, scores of them, encircling him in night. Cain's breath shuddered in his chest. He thought this was it, that he'd die there, another nameless ghost swallowed by desert and time. But none drew a weapon. They only stood watching, judging. And as the stars burned high above, Cain realized the truth with a weight that sank to his bones. He had given away his horse, his one salvation. He had shielded one mother, and now 70 warriors had come to decide what that mercy meant. Cain woke to the press of cold steel against his throat. Dawn light spilled thin across the canyon floor, painting rock and sand in muted red. His breath came sharp as his eyes focused on the man crouched over him. An Apache warrior, face streaked with ochre paint, eyes as unreadable as carved stone. Around him stood more, dozens, maybe more than he could count through the haze of sleep and fear. Bows drawn, spears leveled. Their silence weighed heavier than any shouted threat. Cain forced himself still. His hand twitched toward the rifle slung across his back, but he stopped short. It would be useless here. He was already dead, he just hadn't been told how. Then movement stirred among the circle of warriors. She stepped forward, pale with pain but alive, the woman he had given his horse. She still leaned heavily, one hand against her side, but she stood straight. The child clung to her skirts, his small face wary but unbroken. Her voice carried, firm despite the weakness in her frame. She spoke quick, sharp words in her tongue, and though Cain couldn't understand them, he felt their weight. The warrior's eyes shifted, some narrowing, others softening. The man with the blade at Cain's throat hesitated. The woman's gaze found him. For the first time, it was not suspicion that lived in her eyes, but something else, acknowledgement. She had not forgotten who had lifted her onto that horse. The steel drew back. The circle loosened. Cain exhaled slowly, blood rushing in his ears. He was alive, but far from safe. They bound his wrists with rawhide thongs and marched him through the canyon, 70 strong, their shadows long in the morning light. Cain staggered but kept his jaw set, refusing to stumble. Around him the warriors moved like the land itself, silent, sure-footed, a tide of power that no single man could resist. By midday they reached the village. Wickiups and brush shelters clustered against the cliffs, smoke curling from fire pits. Children darted barefoot between the shelters, stopping to stare at the white man dragged into their midst. Women paused in their grinding of corn, their mending of hides, watching with guarded eyes. Dogs barked, hackles up. Cain felt every gaze cut into him like a blade. They shoved him near the largest fire, where a ring of elders sat. At their center stood the man he had seen on the ridge, tall, broad-shouldered, feathers woven into his dark hair. His presence filled the space with quiet authority. Cain knew at once he was chief. The woman spoke again, gesturing toward Cain. Her voice carried the passion of someone staking more than her life on her words. The boy clung tighter, his eyes darting between Cain and the circle of elders. The chief listened in silence, then turned his gaze on Cain. His eyes were dark and steady, sharp enough to cut through lies. Cain swallowed, the dryness in his throat scraping like sand. He didn't know their tongue, and they didn't know his. All he had were gestures, tone, the truth in his face. So he did what he could. He lifted his bound hands slightly and said low, "I gave her my horse. Nothing more." The warriors around him murmured, some scoffing, others considering. The chief's expression did not change. He spoke a single command, and 2 men dragged Cain to the edge of the camp, tying him to a stake. He would live for now, but whether mercy or cruelty had spared him, Cain couldn't yet tell. The day burned hot. Cain's throat dried until his tongue felt like leather. Sweat stung his eyes. From where he sat bound, he could see the life of the camp unfold. Children laughed, tossing a rawhide ball. Women sang as they worked. Men repaired bows, sharpened blades. It was not the savage chaos he had once been told it was. It was a people living, breathing, guarding their own. The woman appeared again. She knelt beside him, her wound bound with fresh cloth. She set a clay cup of water by his lips, lifting it so he could drink. Cain stared at her, suspicion tangled with gratitude. She gave nothing away, only watching as he swallowed greedily. "Why?" he rasped. Her brow furrowed. She spoke a word he didn't understand, then touched her chest lightly. She repeated it, "Nalin." Cain blinked. "That your name?" She nodded once, then stood and walked away, her child trailing after her. Cain rolled the sound of it in his mind. Nalin. As dusk neared, they brought him before the chief again. The fire crackled high, shadows dancing across painted faces. This time, warriors surrounded him not with drawn weapons, but with expectant silence. The chief spoke, his words deliberate, commanding. Cain couldn't grasp them, but he caught the meaning in the way others reacted. Questions, judgments, the weight of decision. One warrior stepped forward, young and fierce-eyed, scars across his chest. He pointed at Cain, spat a curse, and mimed a blade across his throat. The crowd murmured approval. Another rose, older, calmer, gesturing toward Nalin. He spoke of her, gestured to Cain's empty hands, mimed the act of giving reins. The murmurs shifted, divided. Cain stood in the fire's glow, heart hammering. He knew this was trial, judgment without words he could answer. His life dangled in their debate. He thought of lying, of pleading, but what good would English do here? So he stood straight, let them see his scars, his weary eyes, the truth of a man with nothing left but the choice he'd already made. At last the chief raised his hand. Silence fell. He studied Cain a long while, then gave a single nod. The rope at Cain's wrists was cut. He was not free, but neither was he condemned. He was something in between. The days that followed tested him. He was not given weapons, but he was not left idle. They made him haul water from the river, gather wood, tend the ponies. Warriors watched his every move. Children followed him, laughing, tossing stones to test if he would chase or strike. He bore it all with clenched jaw, each task a weight, but also a chance. At night, he sat alone, listening to the drums and chants of ceremonies he did not understand. Smoke curled into the sky, carrying prayers he could only guess at. He thought of his past, of raids where men in blue had burned shelters like these, of women's cries, of children's silence. He had been part of it. The shame settled heavy. Maybe this was his penance. On the fourth day, Nalin came again. She spoke slowly, repeating words, pointing to objects, fire, water, sky. Cain stumbled through them, his tongue awkward, but she smiled faintly when he tried. Her boy watched him with wide eyes, then laughed when Cain mispronounced a word. Something loosened in Cain's chest. Trust came slowly, but it came when a storm tore through the canyon. Cain labored beside warriors to lash down shelters, his hands raw from rope. When a horse broke loose, he ran to corral it, earning nods of respect. He did not complain, did not falter, though every muscle ached. One evening, by the fire's edge, the young scarred warrior approached him, the same one who had called for his death. He tossed Cain a spear, short and wicked sharp, and pointed toward a distant ridge. Then he said a single word Cain understood, without needing translation: hunt. They climbed together, silence thick. The warrior moved swift as shadow, Cain stumbling to keep pace. At the ridge they crouched, spotting deer, grazing below. The warrior gestured. Cain should try. Cain tightened his grip on the spear, heart thudding. He hurled it with all the strength left in him. The weapon flew wide, clattering against rock. The deer bolted, white tails flashing as they vanished. The warrior barked a laugh, sharp and derisive. Cain flushed hot, jaw tight, but then the young man nodded once, as if saying the effort mattered more than the failure. They returned to camp, no meat carried, but something unspoken shifted between them. That night, Cain sat near the fire with Nalin and her boy. She told him more words, patient, her voice soft. He listened, repeating, fumbling but grateful. When the boy grew sleepy and curled against his mother, Cain felt something stir in him he thought long dead, a warmth, fragile but real. The next morning, scouts returned breathless. Their words cracked the air like a whip. Cain caught fragments, but the meaning came clear from the camp's reaction. Soldiers. They were coming. Warriors gathered weapons, sharpening blades, stringing bows. Women hurried children into shelters, packing what they could. Drums beat, low, steady, like a heart preparing for battle. Cain stood at the edge of it, watching the storm gather. The chief approached him, eyes dark and unflinching. He spoke low, his tone grave. Cain did not understand the words, but he understood the choice offered. His gut tightened, the past rising in a flood, the blue coats, the fire, the blood. Nalin's gaze found him across the camp. The boy held her hand, eyes wide with fear. Cain's chest ached at the sight. The chief waited. Warriors circled close, some glaring, some expectant. The meaning was clear. Would he stand with them, or would he stand against them? Cain's breath came slow. His hands clenched. Every road he'd taken since the war had led him here, to this moment, to this people he had once been taught, were enemies. He thought of the mother he had shielded, the child who laughed at his clumsy words, the warriors who had judged him and still let him live. He lifted his head, met the chief's gaze, and gave a single steady nod. The camp erupted into motion. Plans were spoken, strategies laid. Cain listened, piecing together fragments, offering what little he knew of soldier tactics. The chief regarded him with measured respect, but the decision was made. Cain was no longer a prisoner. He was part of what came next. As night fell, the firelight danced against painted faces and sharpened steel. Cain sat among them, the weight of his choice pressing heavy, but his heart steadier than it had been in years. For the first time since the war, he felt something he hadn't thought possible: belonging. And yet, as the drums pounded into the night and the wind carried the distant scent of smoke, Cain knew this belonging would be tested come dawn, when soldiers marched and blood once again stained the earth. The night before battle was a living thing. Smoke curled from the fires, carrying the smell of mesquite and sweat. The drums beat low, a heartbeat echoing through the canyon walls. Shadows of warriors flickered against the stone, bodies painted, feathers swaying, eyes sharp as flint. They moved with purpose, sharpening blades, stringing bows, checking rifles scavenged from raids. Women tied bundles, coaxed children into the arms of elders who would lead them to the safety of distant caves. The air trembled with fear and resolve. Cain sat near the fire, his hands steady though his heart thundered. He had spent the day among them, offering what he knew of the soldiers' ways. How they moved in formation, how they relied on open ground, how they faltered in narrow passes. The chief had listened, silent, absorbing each word. Now, as night deepened, the plan took shape. The canyon would be their trap, the rocks their shield. They would not run. Nalin sat nearby, her wound bound tight, the boy asleep across her lap. She caught Cain's gaze through the firelight, her eyes steady. No words passed between them, yet he felt the weight of what bound them. He had saved her once. Now, by dawn, he would fight to keep her alive again. The young scarred warrior, the one who had once called for Cain's death, crouched beside him. He thrust a bow into Cain's hands, then a quiver of arrows. Cain tested the string, unfamiliar but willing. The warrior smirked, half challenge, half approval. They were no longer strangers. The chief rose, tall against the flames. His voice carried in the Apache tongue, firm and commanding. Even without understanding, Cain felt the meaning, words of courage, of duty, of ancestors watching. The warriors answered with a chorus of cries, fierce and wild, echoing off stone until the canyon itself seemed to roar. Cain's skin prickled. He was part of it now. The drums ceased. Silence fell vast and heavy. Men and women lay close to the fire, resting in brief snatches. Cain did not sleep. He watched the stars, bright as cut glass, and thought of the war, of the lives he had taken, of the hollow years after. Tomorrow might be the end. But if so, at least it would mean something. Dawn bled across the horizon in shades of copper and gold. The warriors took their places along the ridges, bows drawn, rifles ready. Cain crouched behind a rock, heart hammering. The canyon stretched below, like an open throat waiting to swallow. The first sound was the jangle of bridles. Then came the soldiers, dozens of them, blue coats stark against the pale sand, rifles gleaming. They marched in rigid lines, confident, unaware. Their officer rode at the front, chin high, eyes scanning the cliffs with contempt. Cain gritted his teeth. He knew their kind, the arrogance, the certainty that the land and its people would bow to them. But the land had other ideas. A hawk's cry split the morning. The signal. Arrows whistled down from the cliffs, striking with deadly precision. Horses screamed, rearing. Men shouted, rifles snapping up. The canyon erupted in thunder. Cain loosed his first arrow, clumsy but true enough to graze a soldier's arm. He grabbed another, firing again, the rhythm building. Around him, warriors moved like shadows, striking, vanishing, reappearing in places the soldiers could not see. Smoke from gunfire curled upward, choking the sky. The soldiers tried to form ranks, but the canyon betrayed them. Bullets clanged off rock. Men fell, clutching wounds, their cries drowned in the chaos. Cain fired, ducked, reloaded. Sweat poured down his temples, dust caked his mouth. He saw the young scarred warrior leap from a ledge, spear flashing, driving into a soldier's chest. He saw another Apache fall, blood darkening the sand. Through it all, Cain's eyes sought Nalin. She had taken shelter near the rear. The boy clutched close, but even she held a rifle, her jaw set with iron. She fired once, the recoil nearly toppling her, but her bullet found its mark. Cain felt pride surge in his chest. Then he saw the danger. A group of soldiers had broken through, circling toward her. Cain's stomach clenched. He sprinted from cover, arrows forgotten, rifle unslung in one smooth motion. He fired, dropping the first man, then another. The third raised his bayonet, charging. Cain swung his rifle like a club, the crack of wood against skull, ringing through the chaos. The soldier crumpled, blood pooling. Cain staggered, chest heaving. Nalin stared at him wide-eyed. For a heartbeat, their gazes locked, and he saw gratitude there, fierce and raw. But there was no time. More soldiers surged. The battle swelled, a tide neither side could contain. Cain fought shoulder to shoulder with the scarred warrior, arrows and bullets flying. His arms burned, his lungs screamed, but he did not falter. He thought of the boy's laughter, of the chief's steady gaze, of Nalin's eyes in the firelight. Each thought was a shield stronger than steel. A shot rang out. Pain exploded through his shoulder, knocking him to the ground. His vision blurred, sand grinding into the wound. He groaned, forcing himself upright. A soldier loomed over him, bayonet poised to strike. Cain's fingers closed around a fallen spear. He thrust upward, the blade sinking deep. The soldier gasped, staggered, and fell. Cain collapsed, blood soaking his shirt, breath ragged. The world tilted, voices swirling. He dimly heard the war cry of the Apache, fierce and triumphant. Through the haze he saw soldiers retreating, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead behind. The canyon floor was a graveyard of blue coats and spent shells. Strong hands lifted him. The scarred warrior's face swam into view, grim but alive. He half-carried, half-dragged Cain back toward the camp. Nalin rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside him, pressing cloth against the wound. Her boy clutched Cain's hand, tears streaking his dusty face. Cain tried to speak, but his throat was raw. At last he managed, "You're safe." Nalin's hand lingered against his cheek, her eyes shining with something beyond words. She murmured his name, not perfectly but enough. Cain closed his eyes, pain easing beneath the sound. By nightfall, the camp burned with firelight and song. The soldiers had been driven back, the village spared. Warriors danced, their voices rising to the stars. Cain sat among them, his arm bound, body weak but spirit fierce. He had bled for them, and in return they had given him something he had long forgotten, kinship. The chief approached, carrying a painted feather. He placed it in Cain's hand, then spoke, his voice solemn. The words were in Apache, but the meaning needed no translation. Cain was no longer an outsider. He was brother. Emotion burned Cain's throat. He bowed his head, clutching the feather tight. Around him, the people cheered, voices fierce and joyful. Nalin stood nearby, her boy pressed against her side, both watching with quiet pride. That night, Cain sat at the edge of camp, staring into the flames. The pain in his shoulder throbbed, but it was a small thing compared to the weight lifted from his soul. He thought of all he had done, all the blood he had spilled. Mercy had once seemed impossible, yet mercy had led him here. He had shielded one mother, and a nation had called him brother. The drums slowed, fading into silence. The stars stretched endless above, cold and bright. Cain felt the land breathe around him, felt himself part of it in a way he never had before. And though tomorrow would bring more struggle, more hardship, he no longer feared the road ahead. He was no longer a ghost wandering the desert. He was a man reborn in fire, in blood, in mercy. The dawn after victory carried no triumph, only smoke. The canyon floor was littered with bodies, the groans of the dying carried on the wind. Ravens circled overhead, their black wings casting brief shadows over the carnage. Cain stood among it all, his arm bound, his breath shallow. Every bone in his body ached. But worse than that was the weight of memory pressing down on him. He had seen battlefields before, but this had been fought not for conquest, not for flag, but for survival. That truth clung to him like dust in his lungs. Nalin moved between the wounded, her hand steady, her eyes clear. The boy trailed her, carrying water skins, his little face set with a seriousness no child should bear. Cain watched them both, something stirring in him that was neither longing nor regret, but a deep tethering he could not name. He had given up his only horse to her days ago. Now, it felt like he had given something far greater. The chief called him at midday. Cain followed to the ridge where the old man stood, his gaze sweeping the horizon. Smoke from army campfires curled in the far distance, faint but visible. The soldiers would not stay gone for long. They will return, Cain said, voice rough. The chief gave a slow nod. Stronger. More. The river of blue coats does not end. Cain clenched his jaw. Then you need move. Southwest, anywhere but here. The old man's eyes flicked toward him. And you? Where will you go? White man with Apache blood on his hands. Cain had no answer. Once he might have ridden until the horizon ended, but now he looked back toward Nalin, toward the boy, toward the scarred warrior who had fought beside him. Something inside him refused to turn his back. They'll keep coming, Cain murmured, more to himself than the chief, unless someone stops them before they reach you. The chief's silence was not agreement, but it wasn't dismissal either. He let the thought hang in the air, carried by the wind, until Cain felt its weight settle like iron. That night, Cain could not rest. The pain in his shoulder burned, but it was nothing compared to the turmoil inside him. He sat apart from the fires, watching the shadows of warriors dancing to mourn and honor the dead. The boy crept over, sitting beside him without a word. After a long silence, the child asked in halting English, "You stay?" Cain stared into flames. His whole life had been spent running from war, from memories, from himself. But now, with a boy's small voice anchoring him, running felt like betrayal. "Yes," he said, the word heavy but certain. "I'll stay." The boy's eyes brightened, and for the first time since Cain had met him, a smile cracked through his solemn face. Cain felt something break open in his chest, sharp and fierce. By morning, scouts returned. The soldiers had pulled back, regrouping miles away. They would march again soon, in greater numbers. Cain knew their ways. He had been one of them once. They would not suffer humiliation. They would strike harder, determined to crush what they could not control. Cain made his choice before the sun was high. He took the scarred warrior aside, speaking through broken words and gestures. He would ride to the soldiers, draw them off, lead them into the desert where they would waste their strength and thirst. Alone, he could move like a shadow. Alone, he could end this before it began. The warrior's face hardened, suspicion sparking in his eyes. But after a long pause, he clasped Cain's forearm, a silent bond. When Nalin learned of it, her fury was quiet but cutting. She found him at the edge of camp, saddling a horse not his own. Her eyes blazed in the morning light. "You would leave us to fight alone?" she asked, her voice steady though her hands trembled. Cain shook his head. "No, I'll lead them away. It's the only way you'll be safe." "You will die," she said flatly. "Maybe." He tightened the cinched strap, his movements rough. "But better me than 70 more of you." Her jaw set, and for a moment he thought she might strike him. Instead, she stepped closer, close enough he could feel her breath. "Do not think your death will save us. Do not think leaving is the same as protecting." Cain looked at her, the fire in her eyes, the boy hovering behind her with wide, fearful gaze. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that sacrifice had meaning, that redemption demanded blood. But the words died on his tongue. Instead, he swung into the saddle. The boy ran forward, clutching his leg. "No!" Cain's heart clenched. He placed a rough hand on the boy's head, the gesture awkward, desperate. "Take care of your mother," he whispered and spurred the horse. The desert swallowed him in heat and silence. For 2 days he rode, circling wide, leaving trails for the soldiers to follow. He knew how their minds worked, how their officers would think, pride wounded, eager for revenge. And they came as he knew they would, their columns stretching like a snake across the sand. Cain pushed his horse hard, leading them deeper, away from the canyon, away from the people he had come to call his own. Each night, he lit fires in the distance, leaving tracks that drew them on. By the third day, his horse staggered, foam streaking its chest. Cain dismounted, whispering a rough thanks, and turned the animal loose. From here, he would walk. The soldiers pressed closer. Cain could hear them now, the clatter of gear, the barked commands, the curses carried on the wind. He led them into the basin, a stretch of desert dry as bone, where even the hardiest cactus clung to life. Here, no water waited. Here he would make his stand. He found the ridge at dusk, jagged rocks rising from the sand like broken teeth. From there he could strike. He checked his rifle, his dwindling ammunition. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the certainty that this was the end. As the first ranks appeared, dust rising behind them, Cain took aim. The crack of his rifle split the silence, and a soldier fell. Another shot, another man down. Shouts rang out, the column faltering. Cain fired again, the recoil jarring his wounded shoulder. Pain seared, but he gritted his teeth. He had no choice but to endure. They charged the ridge, but he moved like a ghost, firing, vanishing, reappearing. For hours he harried them, turning their march into chaos. The desert did the rest. Men staggered in the heat, tongues swollen, canteens empty. Cain fought until his rifle clicked dry, then drew the fallen soldier's pistol, each shot a prayer, each bullet a plea for those he had left behind. When the last round was spent, Cain stood at the ridge, chest heaving, vision blurred with sweat and blood. The soldiers closed in, a ring of bayonets glinting in the dying sun. He clenched his fists, ready for the end. And then war cries split the sky. From the cliffs poured the Apache, led by the scarred warrior, their voices fierce, weapons flashing. Nalin rode among them, rifle in hand, the boy clutching at her waist. The sight stole Cain's breath. They had followed him. They had not abandoned him to his sacrifice. The battle erupted in a storm of dust and fury. The soldiers, exhausted and broken, could not withstand it. Cain fought with the last of his strength, shoulder to shoulder, with those he had tried to protect. He saw Nalin fire, saw the boy clutch her tight, saw the scarred warrior drive his spear into the enemy's heart. When it was done, when the desert was quiet save for the groans of the dying, Cain collapsed to his knees. Blood soaked his shirt, his vision dimmed. Nalin was there in an instant, her hands catching him, her voice fierce in his ear. "You do not get to leave us," she whispered. "Not now. Not ever." Cain managed a broken laugh, the sound more blood than joy. "Stubborn woman," he rasped. Her eyes burned, but her grip did not falter. The boy pressed close, his small hands clutching Cain's own. The scarred warrior stood guard, silent, proud. Cain's world narrowed to the warmth of their touch, the sound of their voices, the certainty that, for the first time in his life, he belonged. He had not saved them by dying. He had saved them by standing with them. The desert wind whispered over the dead, carrying the smoke of fires, the echoes of cries. Cain closed his eyes, not in surrender, but in peace. And in that silence, the story of a man who once rode alone ended with something greater. Family, forged not by blood, but by choice.